Don't let the title of this video confuse you. Dune Part 2 is a great movie, maybe even a masterpiece from an aesthetic standpoint. In a film full of visual highs, I think possibly the purest encapsulation of this aesthetic excellence is the stunning gladiator sequence on Giedi Prime, the homeworld of the villainous Harkonnens. In an interview with Inverse, Denis Villeneuve, the film's director, explained the striking artistic choice to depict these sequences in black and white, and more importantly, how it perfectly dovetails with the message of what these scenes are trying to express on screen for him. Denis explains that, to him, quote, "The idea that Giedi Prime sunlight, instead of revealing colors, will kill colors, that their own world will be seen in a daylight as a bleak black and white world will tell us a lot about their psychology." Denis also explained that the film's cinematographer, Greg Fraser, quote, "had the brilliant idea to bring the black and white to infrared, which is a black and white that is more eerie and unique, and it gives almost like an old footage from World War II feeling. The resulting sequence uses visual storytelling to find a way to evoke exactly what Denis wants us to take away from these scenes, without once ever stopping to browbeat us with tedious exposition. It's just too bad for us Dune superfans that Denis' interpretation has little to do with the book that Frank Herbert wrote called Dune. Once again, let's use this scene as an example. Of course, on just a base surface level, it's ironically funny to me that Denis chose to shoot that scene in black and white when it is possibly, literally, the most colorful scene in the entire novel, with all the richest people in the galaxy peacocking their most extravagant outfits and luxuries for each other. But more important than matching the aesthetic of this moment is whether this scene in Dune Part 2 matches the novel's intent. And as Denis explained, a big reason why he made these aesthetic choices is that it informs us about the character and the psychology of the Harkonnens. In particular, he calls out all of the clear World War II Nazi associations, which makes sense, because Dune Part 2 positions the Harkonnens as space Hitlers.
Are we the baddies?
But very interestingly, space Nazis are not at all what Frank Herbert likens the Harkonnens to, because, well, it's a little simplistic, isn't it? If your book or your movie has an entire great house that dresses only in black, loves murder, and cosplays as fascist powder, it's a pretty safe bet that those are, in fact, the bad guys. By contrast, in the books, the moral issue of the Harkonnens are much more subtle and profound. According to Frank Herbert, Dune's author, the defining sin of the Harkonnens is not that they are the most evil people to have ever walked the galaxy. It's that while the Harkonnens have all the power of a great house, they show zero control or interest in controlling their selfish primal urges. It's no accident that the Bene Gesserit ritual of the Gom Jabbar literally tests whether one can conquer their animalistic urges, and the Bene Gesserit only consider those who pass that test truly human. And this isn't just an aesthetic one-off. Dune Part 2's reinterpretation of what makes the Harkonnens tick trickles down to the character-by-character level too. Take the film's characterization of Fade Rautha, for example. In Dune Part 2, Fade is depicted as a pure, terrifying psychopath who makes everyone with even a shred of decency around him uncomfortable. While this is visually compelling, this is the opposite of his characterization in the books, because once again, there isn't a hell of a lot of nuance to be found in the idea of creepy psychopath, and Frank Herbert's Dune novels are all about subtlety and moral grays. In the novel, Fade is equally scary, but he's scary because he's so charismatic that people are easily fooled into loving him and thinking him as a heroic figure, despite having zero moral compass. Surprisingly, Dune Part 2 is chock full of moments like these, where the film removes the character and thematic choices that make the original book so beloved, and instead give us different characters and different motivations in their place. As a result, I think as a viewer, you actually end up in this weird place when watching the movie where, strangely enough, the less you know or care about the source material, the more you're going to enjoy these movies. Unfortunately for me, I love Frank Herbert's Dune books, both because of its themes and also the shades of gray it tries to portray. So when I watched Dune Part 2, I think what I was looking for was the, quote, Peter Jackson treatment of the source material, a la his Lord of the Rings trilogy. And instead, when I walked out of the theater to Dune Part 2, I felt much more like I was a Ian Fleming fan who just saw his first Sean Connery James Bond movie. And by that I mean, that I thought what I watched was entertaining as heck, but I sure as hell didn't recognize any of those characters up on that screen. I know that sounds like a harsh take. The crazy thing is, on some level, I think Denis actually agrees with me, at least somewhat. While doing press for the film, when asked about his perspective on adaptation, Denis said,
It's a true adaptation in the sense that it's like my take on the book. They are like a strong decision that were made in order to be faithful to Frank Herbert. So in some strange way, I had to be. My goal was to be faithful to Monsieur Herbert and less to the book, more to Frank.
Hold on to that thought. We're going to come back to that. But before we get there, we first need to look at how Dune Part Two's changes affect its adaptation. So in order to do that, let's evaluate the changes made to the three main characters of its story: Chani, Jessica, and Paul. Movie Chani versus Book Chani. To start with, let's give old Denis the benefit of a doubt and start with the best case example for Dune Part 2's adaptation: Chani. Book Chani is definitely more passive than Movie Chani, and there's no real doubt about that. In Dune the novel, Chani is a pretty straightforward character. She is defined almost exclusively by two things, which are, number one, her status as a Fremen, and number two, her relationship to Paul, plus her role as, quote, Paul's heart. In the books, Chani is probably the major window for readers into the beliefs and cultural expectations of the Fremen. Importantly, this is a completely different culture that's alien to Paul and most Western readers, with its own values, which, yes, includes things like communal ownership of scarce resources like water, but also, and potentially more strikingly, polygamy. Of course, in the novel, Chani isn't just a Fremen. She's also heavily defined by her relationship to Paul. In the books, Chani is Paul's rest. She's the only one he doesn't use his powers with, the only one he is completely himself with. In return, Book Chani loves Book Paul absolutely, so much so that it's actually explicitly called out in the text that she would be the first one to insist that Paul take a different wife if it was in his political advantage to do so. This love humbles Paul. It's the thing he cherishes most in the world. With all of that said, outside of those two elements, we don't get much more from Book Chani. She's definitely not a co-protagonist like she is in Dune Part 2. Unfortunately, she simply doesn't have as rich of an interior world as a character. Movie Chani, by way of contrast, is a whole other story. If anything, Movie Chani is defined by her religious skepticism. This makes a certain amount of sense, as religious conflict, religious indoctrination, and prophecy is the plot thread that Denis based his entire streamlined adaptation of Dune on, as he explained during an interview with the Real Blend podcast.
First of all, the first decision that was made in part one was that the adaptation will focus on the Bene Gesserit sisters. For the people who know the book, there's like the Spacing Guile, there's the Mantat, which are as important, but from what deeply inspired me about the book and what I feel was relevant with our time was to explore this idea of people using religion as a weapon, as a means of control, and as a tool of power.
I think it's important to take a moment and call out that Denis is absolutely correct here. For a successful novel-to-film adaptation, you simply have to focus on certain elements of a novel at the expense of others. But of course, Dune Part 2 doesn't just focus on certain events of the book and omits others. Would it surprise you to hear that the entire North-South religious fundamentalism conflict between the Fremen simply doesn't exist in the novel? Denis made this up completely for the movie out of whole cloth.
Imagination.
Therefore, Movie Chani's entire drive, her arc, and all associated choices also don't exist in the novel. Those two were made up completely fresh for the film. This is important. By making up these central plot points, the creators of Dune Part 2 aren't just focusing on certain book subplots at the expense of other book subplots, which is only natural to adaptation. Instead, Dune Part 2 the film makes up new central plot points, significant plot points. This has a lot of far-reaching implications. But to bring it back down to just one specific Chani example, Book Chani never leaves Paul at the end of the novel, whereas the entire cliffhanger of the second film is that movie Chani rejects Paul's choices at the end of Dune Part Two. And why would Book Chani ever do that? That single choice goes completely against the character as written by Frank Herbert, because, as a reminder, the only two things we actually know about Book Chani is, number one, she's a Fremen accustomed to polygamy, especially for political reasons, and number two, she loves Paul and trusts him implicitly, no matter what.
Be faithful to Monsieur Herbert and less to the book.
At the same time, once again, let's try to give Denis and the Dune Part 2 team the benefit of the doubt here. It's easy to argue that maybe Denis is just adding a few extra flourishes to the story here for a couple possible reasons. Maybe just to give Part 2 a little bit more of a high-stakes Empire Strikes Back type ending. Or maybe just to add a little more strong female characterization to a story that, let's face it, is so male viewpoint forward that the most distinctive feature of the landscape is literal 1,000-foot-tall sand penises. Moreover, didn't Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, a film trilogy I mentioned favorably earlier, also buff Arwen's character role and screen time for similar reasons? Well, kinda. I think there are absolutely versions of these changes that work well and result in a strong adaptation from book to screen. But it's important to call out that the accentuation of Arwen's character in Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy does nothing to denature the core story or characterization of any of its other characters. It's just, a little bit of extra seasoning. With that in mind then, I think the question that Dune Part 2 has to answer is, does Dune Part 2's character changes to Chani and to Dune's overarching story either, at worst, do nothing to the main story or characters like Arwen in Lord of the Rings, or, at best, do these changes actually make the story closer to Herbert's original intent like Denis claims? Or, instead, do they materially change other characters in the story? Enter Lady Jessica. Movie Jessica versus Book Jessica. In the novel version of Dune, Chani isn't the co-protagonist, Lady Jessica is. And on some level, the films operate this way too, or at least Dune Part 1 does. But in Dune Part 2, Jessica's story quickly gets fast-forwarded to what is, in my opinion, possibly the worst adapted component in the entire film series so far, the Water of Life ritual, which Jessica must undergo in order to cement her position amongst the Fremen as their Reverend Mother. And it's here where the question we asked about whether Dune Part 2's changes to Chani and Dune's storyline had any negative impact to other characters really comes back to bite us hard. Because, while I think it's fair to argue that the changes we've identified so far quite possibly have a negligible impact on the relatively minimal presence of Frank Herbert's Chani, they absolutely destroy his character of Lady Jessica. With that said, once again, let's try to cut Denis and the Dune Part 2 team as much slack as possible. I recognize that adapting the patently insane, psychedelic experience that is the Water of Life ritual into a big-budget blockbuster film was always going to be tough. And also, of course, the books have significantly more real estate to describe what is actually going on when Jessica has her consciousness expanded. But in my humble opinion, Dune Part 2's adapted version, which is to turn the Water of Life into an evil magic Kool-Aid that strips you of your previous agency and instantly transforms you into a mustache-twirling bad guy, is most definitely not the right answer. While Book Jessica's Water of Life experience was most definitely consciousness-expanding and life-changing in the novel, afterwards, Jessica's character, her moral choices, and her point of view that we read in her subsequent narration stay more or less consistent before and after her experience in the novel. By contrast, as soon as movie Jessica drinks the Water of Life, both her characterization and any resemblance to the Lady Jessica we read about in the book are completely obliterated. Right after drinking the water, movie Jessica not only starts creepily talking to her unborn fetus about plans to use religious fundamentalism in order to consolidate power for her son, she also starts using the voice the Bene Gesserit power that compels people to do things against their will in order to get access for Paul himself to drink the water of life, something which is expressly forbidden. Once again, nothing even close to this happens in Frank Herbert's version of Dune. In fact, book Jessica, in contrast to movie Jessica, specifically expresses her dismay when she finds out that Paul drank the water of life. Why would she want him drinking it? As far as she knows, it would kill him, and she loves him. I think it's also important to call out that this new Jessica that we get for the movie after the water of life is not a one-off, off-note scene in the movie adaptation. In fact, after the Water of Life ceremony, every single remaining Jessica scene in action by Lady Jessica in Dune Part Two are moments that never happened in the novel, and all seem invented to portray Jessica as a creepy villain. For example, book Jessica never uses the voice to compel the Keeper of the Sand Trout to let Paul drink the Water of Life. And of course, book Jessica also never forces Chani against her will to participate in Paul's Water of Life ritual. Remove these moments from the movie, and the only other Lady Jessica scenes in Dune Part 2 after the Water of Life transformation are just her creepily muttering to her evil fetus, which, again, doesn't happen in the book because Aaliyah is already born in the novel version of those scenes. I don't reflexively hate all of these changes. On a purely visceral level, I thought that if the Dune Part 2 team thought that the idea of having tiny baby Aaliyah both alive and killing grandfathers like some sort of tiny, patricidal, backflipping Yoda is simply unfilmable for your big-budget blockbuster movie, and so made the adaptation choice to keep Jessica pregnant throughout all of Dune Part 2, well, I get that. What's more, if you've already made that choice, then I think that showing Jessica unsettlingly talking to her unborn but unaware fetus is a brilliant idea to underscore the unnaturalness of taking the water of life while pregnant. But personally, the bridge too far in Lady Jessica's character assassination compared to the novel came with the dialogue that Denis wrote for Jessica in those muttering scenes. Because to me, those muttering moments seem like a perfect opportunity for Denis to slip in some obscure or abstract metaphysical dialogue or concepts that he had to cut elsewhere from the novel. Instead, all we get in these scenes are new dialogue. And not just new dialogue, but overwritten, melodramatic statements like,
"Our task in the north is nearly done.
or,
Now we go south. There are millions of fundamentalists there."
that push us towards an uncomplicated, purely negative perspective of both Lady Jessica and the Water of Life. In fact, there is literally only one single line of dialogue in any of those muttering scenes that is not written by Denis but is taken by the book verbatim. And that is when baby Aaliyah tells Jessica that she disapproves of Paul and Chani's relationship because Paul, quote,
She says you're blinded by love, and she reminds you that you must reserve your hand for the most strategic alliance.
And this choice in adaptation is really interesting because I think it's yet another really important case study in my disappointment in some of the choices in adapting Dune the novel into Dune Part 2. And that's because, even though this line is technically from the book, it's been ripped out of its context, stripped of its meaning, and placed in one of those creepy muttering scenes to give it a much more menacing conspiratorial air than it was delivered in the novel. Importantly, in Frank Herbert's Dune, this is not a line that's delivered by Aaliyah. Instead, it's said by Lady Jessica herself, and it's a big key to understanding a beautiful part of her character arc that Frank Herbert wrote into Dune. Because while this belief that Chani is beneath Paul may be where Jessica's character in the novel starts, it's not where she ends. Let me explain. Right at the beginning of Dune the novel, one of Jessica's chief complaints is that she is not married to Paul's father Leto. She accepts the political utility of this, as an unmarried Leto with the potential of a political marriage is much more attractive to other great houses, even if he never acts on it. But at the same time, Jessica resents it. That's why it's so very interesting that as soon as Paul finds himself in a similar situation by the middle of Dune the novel, i.e., he's unmarried but in love with Chani, who does him no political favors, Jessica's not empathetic with Chani, but straight up disapproves. Like so many parents in real life, she gets stuck in the systems and expectations of the past of what's needed for her son to, quote, get ahead, rather than examine that choice through the lens of her own experience. This paradox is part of what makes Book Jessica such a compelling, three-dimensional character. But it doesn't end there. Something really interesting happens in the book version. Over time, Lady Jessica sees how Chani treats her son, and she changes her mind. Chani actually is what's best for Paul, title and status be damned. She believes this so strongly that Jessica pleads with Paul in the novel to make, quote, the selfish choice, to not worry about the future and politics and great houses, and just live a happy, uncomplicated life with Chani like she and Leto never could. And although Paul ultimately does what he thinks he must in order to save everyone he loves, which in this case is a ceremonial marriage to Irulan, the very final line of Dune the book finds Jessica, once bitterly suspicious of Chani, now trying to comfort her as Chani finds herself in the exact same situation Jessica once suffered with Leto. She tells Chani that Irulan, the politics, it doesn't matter, and that, quote, history will remember us as wives. It's a banger of a line and such a testament to how far Book Jessica the character has come in Dune the novel, which is what makes it such a letdown that we didn't get to see that growth from movie Jessica in the film adaptation. Of course, that's just a minor letdown in the grand scheme of things, relative to what's coming.
Paul Boisy Atreides, Duke of Arrakis!
But before we move on to Paul and the differences of his character in Dune Part Two in Frank Herbert's novel, I want to circle back to Denis' comments about his adaptation.
Be faithful to Monsieur Herbert and less to the book.
What on earth did Denis mean by that? Well, when doing press for the release of Dune Part 2, Denis explained that
when Frank Herbert wrote the book, and then when the book came out, he was disappointed how people perceived Paul Atreides. At the time, he felt that people were talking about Paul as a hero.
Sure.
And for him, he was an anti-hero. He was a dark figure. The book was a warning for him about a messianic figure, and for that he wrote Dune Messiah to correct and to make sure that people understood his intention. And I knew that story. I knew I had the benefit of having read Dune Messiah, so I wrote Part 2 having that in mind, and that is why Chani's character is slightly different in my adaptation than in the book, and helped me to bring the initial intention of Frank Herbert to the screen.
this revelation obviously casts Denis' interpretive choices in a whole new light, and potentially completely destroys all my complaints about the film, right? There's just one problem with this explanation. Denis is completely in the wrong here. But don't just take my word on that. Listen to Frank Herbert tell you himself from an interview at UCLA in 1985.
And I sat down to do a book. The book as I conceived of it was the first 3 books. There were one book in my head.
And in case you thought that speech was a fluke for some reason, in a separate print interview with Jean Marie Stein, Herbert reiterates, quote, "The first 3 books, Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune, were one book in my head. I wrote parts of the second 2 before I completed the first." So Denis' supposed justification for all of these changes to the story to, quote, "be faithful to the real story," completely break down. And while I think that fundamental misunderstanding provides huge insight on just why so many choices in adaptation might have gone so far astray in Dune Part 2, I think that there is an even more important disagreement between Denis and Frank Herbert that is easy to miss, one that hits at the very level of character. Denis says that according to Frank Herbert,
people were talking about Paul as a hero.
Sure.
And for him, he was an anti-hero. He was a dark figure.
But when Frank Herbert talks about Paul's character, he sounds very different. When trying to explain the themes that were important to him in writing Dune, Herbert said, quote, "I had a theory. Charismatic leaders, not necessarily messiahs, but messiahs included, tend to create explosive upheavals in human societies which are very dangerous to individuals and to the societies themselves because they create power structures. So you get these centers of power, and it doesn't matter a damned bit how pure and good the hero is." So I wanted to create a charismatic leader, Paul Muad'Dib, the hero of the novel and film, a messiah you would follow for all of the right reasons. He's loyal to his people, he's honorable, and he's true to his friends. And there is the power structure that grows up around him. That's what we deal with in the second book. That shook a lot of people. Here was a hero who didn't make everything all right. He created a power structure. He did it just by being there. Then, in a completely separate interview, and with none other than a shockingly young pre-Today Show Bryant Gumbel no less, Herbert reiterated.
What is the message? What is the statement that you're attempting to make here?
Don't trust leaders to always be right. I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person. For all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons.
Now, does that interpretation of Paul's character sound like the Paul you watched in theaters? Do the changes that Denny said were necessary to be made to Paul's character in order to match the supposed, quote, true interpretation of Dune fit Herbert's own perspective on the character? It's okay if you don't have an answer yet, but keep that question in your mind as we look at Movie Paul versus Book Paul. While there are a million small ways that Movie Paul and Book Paul are different, I think there are 5 key plot moments where Dune Part 2 differs so drastically from Dune the novel that they feel like completely different characters, at least to me. Number 1. Like so many of the other characters we've mentioned so far, the first major plot difference that separates Movie Paul from Book Paul is that Dune Part 2 makes a huge deal about whether or not Paul will decide to go south to the fundamentalist Fremen, and, of course, what that resulting choice means regarding his characterization and morality in the film. In the movie version, Paul explicitly explains that if he decides to go south, it's that decision that makes his violent visions of religious war come true. Obviously, in the film, Paul does decide to go south despite all of what that means, and we all know how that ends for his character. As I've called out a few times before, this north-south fundamentalism thing is completely made up for the movie and doesn't exist in the book, so there's no real equivalent character choice for Paul to make in the novel here. What's interesting is that the novel's equivalent decision for Paul, if there is one, is much earlier in the story. In fact, it's right after the attack from the Harkonnens, when Paul and Lady Jessica flee from the ambush into the desert to close that first half of the book. In the desert, Paul thinks that he had seen 2 main branchings along the way ahead. In one, he confronted an evil old baron and said, "Hello, grandfather." The thought of that path and what lay along it sickened him. The other path held long patches of gray obscurity except for peaks of violence. He had seen a warrior religion there, a fire spreading across the universe with the Atreides green and black banner waving at the head of fanatic legions drunk on spice liquor. Yes, they'll call me Muad'Dib, the one who points the way. So why on earth did the movie, number 1, move this choice to this point in the story, and number 2, change the options provided to Paul when he's making this choice? I think it's because most of us would root for Paul to decide to not join the evil Harkonnens, especially right after that attack. Most of us would say that Paul absolutely has a right to live, and not only to live, but to get justice for the murder of his father and house. But in Dune the novel, Frank Herbert presents both us as the audience and Paul the character with the idea that either Paul has to just give up and give in to the Harkonnens, or by deciding to survive and fight back, that everything else that is coming is the inevitable endpoint of simply choosing to live. By moving this big decision in the movie version to a point in the story where Paul already has found a way to survive without all the killing in his name, it allows the movie audience to very easily consider Paul's choice here as uncomplicatedly wrong, whereas readers of Dune the novel find Paul's equivalent choice to be much more morally complicated. For what it's worth, I also think that's why it feels so strange in the movie version when Paul suddenly decides to go south after he's fought against that choice for so long in the film and has such clear moral conviction over that choice. To be fair, I think the movie version tries to lead us towards a potential justification of that moment in the story with the idea that Paul is so shocked that he didn't see the ambush on the CH coming, so he ultimately decides to travel south in order to, quote, get greater power. But I'm not sure that works for me on a narrative level, at least personally. Does that mean that movie Paul is now okay with committing genocide because some of his friends got killed? Or is he not sure that it will come true now because he doesn't have perfect vision? And why would he think that going south would give him that vision? Regardless of the answers here, I think it's safe to say that part of the reason why it feels so weird here story-wise in the movie is because this dilemma simply doesn't exist in the book. So the movie has to insert this dilemma here and then immediately resolve it in order for the other changes in its story and for its changes in Paul's character to make any sense. Number 2. The second major difference between movie Paul and book Paul is, just like with Lady Jessica, everything that happens during Paul's Water of Life ritual. While book Paul, just like book Jessica, is more or less the same character that makes the same kinds of moral choices after drinking the Water of Life in the novel as he did before drinking it. Just like with movie Jessica, as soon as movie Paul wakes up from his evil Kool-Aid-driven nap, his characterization completely changes. In the very next scene after he awakens, Paul reveals to Jessica in conversation that she's Baron Harkonnen's daughter, and then says,
"So this is how I will survive. By being Harkonnens."
Which, of course, casts every subsequent action that Paul makes in the rest of the movie into alopecic Hitlerian terms. Care to take a guess whether Paul ever says, "This is how we will survive by being Harkonnens" in the novel? Of course not. In the novel, Paul never connects his subsequent actions with the morality of the Harkonnens. In fact, it's literally the opposite. That's because, in the novel, book Paul realizes that he and Jessica are Harkonnens way before drinking the Water of Life. In fact, the exact moment he realizes it is when he sees those two paths in the desert right after the Harkonnen attack in that passage I just quoted earlier at length. Of course, in the novel version of that moment, it's this exact realization of his family lineage and his disgust at who the Harkonnens are that causes Paul to reject the path where he allies with the Harkonnens and instead chooses the Fremen-based path that he sets upon in both the book and the movie. Dune Part Two, however, completely inverts this decision so that its version of Paul says that his ultimate choice of action is the Harkonnen path, not the anti-Harkonnen path. Doesn't that feel like a very different character in the movie version? Number 3. But of course, the drastic changes to Paul's character don't end there, because the third major difference between movie Paul and book Paul comes with Paul's speech to the Fremen High Council. In the movie version, this scene shows Paul at his most rabid.
Paul Boisdi Atreides!
This entire sequence does an extremely effective job at displaying new Paul, post-Water of Life, at his most Harkonnen-like, as he promised. He's power-hungry, arrogant, manipulative. Contrast this with the book version of the scene. In the novel, Paul and Jessica have already served informally on this council for years. Heck, they've literally trained all of their troops, educating them in Jessica's, quote, weirding ways of fighting that Stilgar was so keen on capturing for his fighters back when he met them years prior. Paul and Jessica are not strangers who have just arrived at the council for the first time and are stepping out of line to speak at the gathering. In Frank Herbert's version, Jessica and Paul have already de facto earned their positions on the council themselves, by deed if not by official ceremony. But even more important than Book Paul's position with the council is the words he uses in the speech itself. In the novel, it's not arrogant, it's powerful and persuasive. This is so important in Frank Herbert's version that Jessica explicitly calls it out. Quote, "He's using the voice well," Jessica thought, "but that's not enough with these people. They've good insulation against vocal control. He must catch them also with logic." In other words, Frank Herbert's version takes the time to explicitly identify that Paul can't hoodwink his way into getting the Fremen to follow him with space magic alone. He has to convince them of the logic of what he's saying. Now compare this to Dune Part Two, where movie Paul changes the tide of sentiment to his favor exclusively by using his power of prescience in order to drive the Fremen to follow him in fervent religious devotion. Additionally, another huge point of distinction between the movie version and book version of the council scene is Paul's interaction with Stilgar. In Dune Part Two, movie Paul arrogantly states that he doesn't need to kill Stilgar in order to take his place as representative on the council, because he is above the council. Unsurprisingly, this is not how it plays out in Frank Herbert's version. Instead, in the novel, this is the exact moment where Book Paul persuades Book Stilgar that he doesn't need to die, that instead, only some of the old ways need to change because it's the most prudent thing to do for the long-term health of the tribe, the thing that Stilgar is most focused on. And then he brings this concept full circle by reminding Stilgar that he's already changed the old ways himself by allowing Jessica and Paul himself to live when they found him in the desert, which, importantly, is something that all the Fremen assembled agree was the right thing to do in retrospect. But maybe you don't see the differences I see in the council scene here. Maybe you're not convinced. If that's the case, then I would say, above and beyond all these other important changes that Dune Part 2 makes to the character of Paul in the council room scene, probably the single most telling change that the film makes is that in the novel, this entire council scene takes place before Paul drinks the water of life. Could you imagine Paul acting like this if he had his interaction with the council before drinking the water of life? Dune Part 2 has to place this council scene afterwards because Paul's cartoonish actions here only make sense because the movie's version of the water of life seems to turn you into a Saturday morning cartoon villain, and because Paul said he was going to win here by being a Harkonnen, which, once again, Frank Herbert's version of Paul never does. The council scene example of how Dune Part 2 edits Paul's words and his choices in order to change his character is very similar to our fourth big plot change between movie Paul and book Paul. Paul's proposed marriage to Irulan in order to seal his claim as emperor of the known universe. In the film, movie Paul simply tells movie Chani, "You trust me, right?" Then surprises her in front of everybody by demanding Princess Irulan's hand in marriage from her father, Emperor Shaddam. And it's this choice, plus the big change we're about to get to here in a minute, that causes movie Chani to abandon movie Paul and go her own way. In the Frank Herbert novel, this moment plays out very differently for two different reasons. Reason number one is that, as mentioned earlier, Book Chani comes from a polygamous culture where it is normal to have more than one partner, especially where political ties are concerned. And remember, technically, Paul actually already has a second wife at this point in the book, as he took Jameis's widow in as a temporary wife, as is Fremen custom, after he killed Jameis in their duel. But even more important than reason number one is reason number two. Unlike in the movie, in the novel, Paul doesn't just spring this on Chani in the moment. Instead, he tells Chani ahead of time what he's going to do and, more importantly, why he's going to do it, in which, in Paul's opinion, he sees this as the only way out to save everybody he cares about. And then, more importantly, says that, quote, "Yet that princess shall have no more of me than my name, no child of mine, nor touch, nor softness of glance, nor instant of desire." And Paul keeps his word on this. The, quote, "marriage to Irulan is only political, never physical or emotional." If the film version kept these elements, wouldn't audiences feel slightly differently about Paul's choices here? Number 5. This brings us to the fifth, the final, and possibly the biggest difference between movie Paul and book Paul. At the end of Dune Part 2, movie Paul explicitly calls for the Fremen's jihad for the sake of his claim to the Empire.
Lead them to paradise.
In my opinion, this is movie Paul's supervillain moment. The moment where he wholesale rejects the ideals he's claimed throughout both films in a clear abuse of the Fremen's trust of their lives for his selfish ends. The moment that causes movie Chani to leave him. Whereas the novels are crystal clear that not only does book Paul hate the jihad and would do anything to stop it if it were in his power, but due to the mistreatment of the Fremen over millennia by the rest of the galaxy, their jihad is coming, whether Paul is there or not. There are a number of important ways that you can establish that this is the correct interpretation of Paul in the novel. On a meta level, for example, All you need to do is to look at Frank Herbert's own evaluation of Paul's character.
I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person. For all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons.
But maybe you're not convinced by those after-the-fact interviews of Frank Herbert. Maybe you think Frank changed his mind after his stories were such big successes or something. Well, what if I told you that we didn't have to take Frank Herbert's meta-commentary or Paul's in-narrative claims at face value? What if I told you that this perspective, that Paul hated the jihad, was clarified in black and white inside the narrative itself, and not just by Paul's own words, but even by Paul's very own enemies inside the story? Well, in Dune Messiah, the sequel book to Dune that Denis Villeneuve is basing his third movie on, two high-ranking officials plotting to overthrow Paul's rule, named Scytale and Edric, have a conversation where they explain that the Fremen jihad was out of Paul's control. Scytale tells Edric that, quote, "It's also safe to assume that if Paul had just ordered the Fremen to stop, they would have had him killed. The Fremen saw themselves as enacting vengeance against a universe that had enslaved and exploited them and their planet for thousands of years. He didn't use the jihad used him. I think he would have stopped it if he could." At this, Edric, Scytale's co-conspirator, balks, interjecting, "If he could," but then Scytale, not missing a beat, barks right back at him, quote, "Oh, be still. You can't stop a mental epidemic. It leaps from person to person across parsecs. It's overwhelmingly contagious. It strikes at the unprotected side, in the place where we lodge the fragments of other such plagues. Who can stop such a thing? Muad'Dib hasn't the antidote. The thing has roots in chaos. Can orders reach there?" Now, does that sound like the Paul you watched in theaters?
For all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons.
I'm not sure how much clearer it can be. The real Paul isn't a villain. The real Paul is a tragic hero. Paul's mistake wasn't so black and white as saying that he'll never call for a jihad and then calling for it when it's convenient. Because, frankly, that's a simple and uninteresting story. It is vital to the story that Dune is interested in telling that Paul maintains his noble motivations even through the jihad. Because one of Dune's central messages is that trusting in centralized power on that scale always turns oppressive, regardless of your good intentions. If Paul's just another malevolent, Kool-Aid drinking tyrant, then Dune's entire message is lost. Because then, us readers and viewers could always say that, well, maybe a different leader with better intentions and stronger morals might have had a better outcome. Just nobody's tried that one yet. In logic, that's called a no true Scotsman fallacy. The whole point of Dune is that Paul is the best of us and tries his best, and it still doesn't work out. And as sad as it makes me to say it, I think that Dune Part Two either fundamentally doesn't get that core message at the heart of Frank Herbert's work, or else it doesn't care about it, and that's a lot sadder of a thought. In closing, and after all this kvetching, I'd like to clarify that actually, I'm not against directors changing material in adaptations, surprisingly. For example, I'm a big fan of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, and one of my favorite scenes in that entire film is when the Joker burns a literal Scrooge McDuck-sized pile of cash in order to make a point, because
all you care about is money. This town deserves a better class of criminals, and I'm gonna give it to him.
Did you know that scene was stolen from Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale's The Long Halloween, and then changed? In that story, it's actually Harvey Dent that does the burning, not the Joker. But there's a huge difference in this adaptation for film. In the comic book version, the only reason that scene is there is just to show how much of a badass Two-Face is. That's it. Chris Nolan took this meaningless, nothing scene as inspiration and elevated it into a shocking moment in his film that not only reveals the character of the Joker, it literally underpins the entire philosophical argument the film is trying to make.
Some men just want to watch the world burn.
while this is a great example of an adaptation straight up improving upon an already strong source material, on the complete other end of the spectrum, I'm also a big fan of Amazon's adaptation of The Boys, or at least season 1 and 2 of The Boys. But I think it's a good example for completely different reasons. Namely, I pretty intensely dislike most of Garth Ennis's writing in general, and his original print version of The Boys in particular. I prefer the adaptation. What makes my attitude different about this adaptation is, well, with such low regard for the source material to start with, I frankly don't give a f*** whether an adaptation, say, version of Huey stays authentic to the quote, original Huey or whatever. And in Amazon's case with The Boys, pretty much every change that they made added depth that was frankly non-existent in the comics, whether we're talking about Butcher's character with the expansions of the stories involving Ryan and his wife, or the expansion of the character of Victoria Newman, Black Noir, the list goes on and on. So, in contrast to this example, my problem with Dune Part 2 is, unlike with The Boys, I'm a die-hard superfan of Frank Herbert's original novels, and moreover, that's because I think they have tremendous narrative depth. And then, also unlike the example of The Dark Knight, I don't think Dune Part 2's narrative changes added to its depth. Instead, it's quite the opposite. Of course, when we talk about film adaptations, the one other series that looms large in everyone's mind is Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I think it's important to call out that there are changes in adaptation in that series too. Arwen's expanded role, Faramir and Aragorn's more fleshed out character arcs, etc., etc. But say what you want about those films, it's remarkable how almost every spoken line in that trilogy are words that Tolkien himself personally wrote, even if Jackson occasionally changes which character says the line for the sake of convenience. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, part of the challenge of film adaptation is that you have so few precious moments on screen to adapt everything that happens in a book. So why does Dune Part 2 waste so much time with so much new content invented for the movie, instead of investing that time into the subplots and dialogue written by Herbert himself, those that contain so much narrative, thematic, and character depth? This may be sacrilegious to say, but in many ways, when you have a compelling, complicated source material, and then you decide to chuck large sections of it for, quote, what you want to do instead, I'm concerned that your adaptation starts to look a lot less like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, and a lot more like Dave Benioff and D.B. Weiss's Game of Thrones, and you know that's not the comparison you want to invite. Okay, that may be a little harsh. I feel a little sick in my stomach even for voicing that. What I will say in praise for Dune Part 2 is, unlike D&D and Game of Thrones, I think that anyone who watches Dune Part 2 with no background knowledge of the novels will be incredibly satisfied. They'll find an awesome roller coaster of a film that not only stuns aesthetically and has incredible acting, its story also finds a way to buck the traditional hero's journey narrative that nearly all other major sci-fi and fantasy films seem to just copy and paste. And while that's an impressive feat for sure, unfortunately, that's just a pale shadow of the depth contained within Frank Herbert's Dune novels. There's so much deeper than that. There's a reason why these books are remembered decades after their release, and will both be relevant and be loved for decades and probably even centuries to come. Thank you for listening to an old man futilely yell into the void of a desert that is the internet.